Hello, and welcome to Elite News, presented by Team Elite. I'm Madison Spermuli, and today we will be discussing confirmation bias. First, it is important to understand what this topic is. Confirmation bias is to seek out information or evidence that supports pre-existing views while ignoring any information or evidence that opposes them. It is crucial to understand what confirmation bias is because it is so prevalent in how we process and judge any information. Confirmation bias affects our ability to judge the accuracy of information because if we see something that supports the bias we have, we are more likely to believe that is true, even if it is not from a reliable source. This is seen almost anywhere information is present, but today we will be focusing particularly on the presence of confirmation bias in the news and education. We will now be turning over to Donna and Sophia to explain confirmation bias in the news.
My name is Donna Marin, and today I'll be interviewing Sophia Galiza on how confirmation bias can influence people watching the news. Good morning, Sophia. How are you today? So, Sophia, have you ever heard of confirmation bias? Madison gave us an amazing definition of confirmation bias, don't you think? Well, as most of us know today, confirmation bias is used in a lot of news nowadays. Would you be willing to give us some examples of when you have seen confirmation bias on the news lately? Confirmation bias can cause conflict between people when it comes to talking about the news. Have you ever seen anyone argue about the news when confirmation bias was present? Or have you ever gotten into an argument about the news with someone from the opposing side? I have heard that people sometimes watch or read news sources just to get information about their side of the argument, even when the source might not be reliable. So now let's talk to Sophia and see how she relates to confirmation bias.
Good morning to you too, Donna Marin. I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. Yes, I've heard of confirmation bias. Madison definitely gave us a great explanation of what confirmation bias is. So, the recent news I saw using confirmation bias is Fox News and CNN News are two opposites. Fox News is Republican. They choose Republican topics to better their news, and CNN News is Democratic and picks Democratic stories for their CNN News. Honestly, I don't watch the news at all, but I do agree that there's definitely been conflict. I have not gotten to any arguments with anyone about the news because I don't pay attention to it. But I did watch the news once in a while, like a really long time ago, and I do remember hearing all this. Confirmation bias. But I'm just not the type of person to follow any type of news. I'm just not really into that stuff, because that's just who I am.
Thank you, Sophia and Donna. As you saw with the previous example, having a confirmation bias is not beneficial in any aspect. The confirmation bias is considered a negative tendency to have because it translates into being ignorant, prevents us from looking at things objectively, and prevents any healthy discussion from occurring. Refusing to see another viewpoint, even if you do not believe in it, can also negatively affect relationships because it causes arguments. We should all aspire to be as unbiased as we can when it comes to any topic so we can approach it by using logic and facts instead of the bias and emotions. Luckily, there are multiple ways to avoid the confirmation bias, which include researching both sides of a topic with an open mind, using credible sources when looking for facts or statistics, and keeping a level head and remaining respectful when discussing views with others. But the best way to avoid the confirmation bias would be to avoid biased media, such as bigger news sources like CNN and Fox News because they use confirmation bias when reporting in order to feed their customers confirmation bias. Next, we will be turning over to Sarah and Jack as they discuss confirmation bias in educational settings.
Thank you, Madison. Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Velarde here and interviewing with Luke Gifford, and we will be going over confirmation bias in an educational environment. How are you today, Luke?
I'm doing really good. How are you today, Sarah?
I'm great. So we can start with jumping right into reviewing the definition Madison gave us first. Confirmation bias is to seek out information or evidence that supports pre-existing views, while ignoring any information or evidence that opposes them. Now, in your own words, how would you describe confirmation bias?
I would describe it like if somebody already has a belief that they feel pretty strongly about, they're probably only going to listen to information that goes along with that belief. And if they ever come across information that goes against it, they probably will just end up ignoring that information.
Excellent. You're absolutely right. And coming from a college student, how often would you say you see confirmation bias in your schooling environment?
I see confirmation bias a lot, especially when a student might bring up a point that is opposite to a teacher's belief. A lot of times the teacher may just discredit the student as being inferior to them, and that the teacher has more experience, so they automatically know fact from fiction.
Totally understand where you're coming from. Could you give an example of when you've seen this action take place around school?
It's hard to place a specific example, but I know in high school that my government teacher, he was very biased, and he practiced confirmation bias a lot whenever we would try to, change his mind or bring up a different point or a different argument.
I see. So do you have any suggestions of ways to eliminate this from happening in the educational atmosphere again?
I could think of a couple ways. Maybe one would be to fact check teachers' lessons before they teach them to kids, because ultimately it's, up to the teachers and the educators to make sure that they're the ones that are making sure that people aren't going to be practicing confirmation bias in the future.
Great. Thank you so much for sitting here and chatting with me today, Luke. Coming up next to keep you informed on incidents relating to confirmation bias at school is Jack. Thank you. Thank you, Madison.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Luke, for participating in the interview. At this point, I believe it's become easy to understand the negative effects confirmation bias can have on the way we develop and support our beliefs. But as Sarah highlighted with the previous interview, confirmation bias is something that extends far beyond politics, making its way into the educational system. Some would argue this is even more detrimental. As the majority of students are taught, when creating your argument, you are meant to prospect for specific points of evidence and sources to substantiate your claim. However, oftentimes the crucial point overlooked is that it's just as important to research and break down any opposing arguments. For college students, this isn't as much of an issue as most of them have already endured countless essays and projects to the point where they know the drill. However, younger students aren't typically as seasoned when it comes to this. Oftentimes this leads to an argumentative assignment to turn into a completely biased perspective. Because of this, confirmation bias practiced in school can potentially lead to students applying it to the real world. The best solution for this would be to ensure that schools are encouraging their students to acknowledge all sides of an argument to potentially eliminate any influx of confirmation bias in the following years.
Thank you, Jack. To recap, we have explored the confirmation bias, which is to seek out information or evidence that supports pre-existing views while ignoring any information or evidence that opposes them. We also took a look at a couple of examples of confirmation bias in the news and at school, where the confirmation bias is most prevalent, and tips on how to avoid it. We hope that we have helped you become more aware of the negativity surrounding having a confirmation bias and have given you the ability to look at topics using a more logical view. Thank you for tuning into Elite News presented by Team Elite. I'm Madison Spermuli, signing off.